China has reaffirmed its support of Russia on security issues. In a phone call between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, the Chinese president backed his Russian counterpart on issues of sovereignty and security. Joining us live with more analysis is James Bowen, Policy Fellow at the Perth USAsia Centre. James, really appreciate your time. Are Russia and China actually on the same page here, or is it just that they share common foes and that's brought them closer together on some of these issues?
Thank you. Well, I think there's been a bit of a long-standing realignment of Russia and China. Obviously, they do have common foes, but they do have shared interests as well. But I think in a lot of cases, there's a marriage of convenience. And I think that, in the case of the war in Ukraine, for example, there might be some misgivings around the close alignment that China does have with Russia, because I'm certainly sure that the Chinese, a lot of Chinese politicians weren't really expecting such a unified Western response to the crisis in Ukraine. They might be having a few doubts around what might be the Western response to future Chinese aggression as well.
What about Australia's relationship with China? Do the early signals we've seen from the new Australian government suggest that a reset of those Australian-China relations is on the cards or not?
Well, I think there's been some initial signs. Obviously, the first diplomatic meeting between the defence ministers on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore is something we haven't seen a diplomatic meeting for the past couple of years. So there's signs that there'll be some sort of normalisation in the relationship. But it's early days, and I think that the Albanese government has been unwilling to say that it's going to make any sort of concessions to China around improving the relationship. So the onus will be on China to actually do the heavy lifting in improving the relationship.
And does it seem to you like China has the motivation to do that?
Not currently. We haven't actually seen any indications that might be the case. And certainly, Australia's been subject to economic coercion by China, cutting off or putting tariffs on a lot of our exports to China, or actually absolute bans on some of our exports to China. And if you look at previous cases where China has imposed those sorts of restrictions, in the case of South Korea or Norway in previous years, the actual resolution to those processes has actually been when those countries have made some sort of concessions. So I think that there's a bit of a game of waiting to see who moves first in this case, and China and Australia both seem to be unwilling to do that. So I don't see a quick or easy resolution from either end at the moment.
We are standing by to take our viewers live to the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. She's in New Zealand and will also be visiting the Solomon Islands. When it comes to that nation's pact with China, is there still a chance Australia can steer the Solomons away from closer ties with China, or has that ship sailed?
Well, I don't think that it's definitely set in stone, but I think that, more broadly, that Australia has to have realistic expectations around its engagement with the Pacific Islands, or any other countries for that reason. These countries are sovereign nations. They're free to choose their partners or to choose what sort of commitments they make to other countries. So Australia has to continue to be realistic around what we can expect. Some countries will continue to enter into agreements with China that we might find unpalatable and unproductive from the point of view of Australia's foreign policy. But we need to continue to engage. And I think that what we've seen from Minister Wong in the early days of this new Australian government is she's just been to the Pacific 3 times. She's been meeting with regional governments. She's taking seriously their concerns rather than just talking about China. She's talking about climate change, which Pacific governments have been very clear is their very number one strategic priority. So I think that we need to continue to work away and build that sort of closeness, build those relationships, and we can see what happens.
You mentioned the Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles meeting with his Chinese counterpart. He's also obviously the Defence Minister and has been in Japan this week, pledging closer military ties with that country. What do closer ties with Japan on a military level actually look like in practice?
So Australia and Japan have agreed, not ratified yet, but something called a reciprocal access agreement, and that will provide for Australian troops to operate within Japan, or Japanese troops to operate in Australia with less strings attached, more regulatory freedom to do that. But that, as I said, that still needs to be ratified. I think that we can't have great expectations because Australia and Japan are not military superpowers. You know, the US is still critical to managing the security affairs of the Indo-Pacific region. But certainly Australia and Japan have become really strong partners in the economic space in the past few years, in the diplomatic space. So I think that to some extent there's a raising the threshold of pushback against particular Chinese aggression in the region, and it will change some of the calculations around that perhaps. But critically, there needs to still be engagement between Australia, Japan and the US in the region. And I think that Australia and Japan having a very close relationship is always beneficial in the sense that, you know, there might be some withdrawal from the region from the US in the next few years as well. We don't know what's going to happen with the next election there. So there could be a return to sort of the Trump years where Australia and Japan were to some extent alone in the region, and we need to build those diplomatic relationships with other partners.
James Bowen, really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much.